which, hey, Zoom folks, I'm telling a story. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the captions so you can see it. But I was telling a story that I'm teaching about gender and sexuality in intro this week, and then we got Freud, so it's lots of sex all the time. And my grad advisor was teaching psychology of adjustment and was covering sexuality when she was pregnant with one of her sons. And she said, she's standing there going, they all know I've had sex. And I was like, well, they probably figured that anyway, Jan. You probably did. But I just thought that that was hilarious. So there we go. I knew I had a pen, it just fell. Alrighty. So real quick, since we do have some folks on Zoom, I want to double check something. Your exams, I will probably grade this weekend. I haven't gotten a chance to look at them yet. So thank you for your patience. I try to get them back within a week usually. So I think. Yeah, I thought I had a link somewhere to the document I'm going to be using today. Apparently I don't. So Zoom folks, I apologize. I will try to email or post on Blackboard a copy later today. Or if you're going to come in on Wednesday, or today's Wednesday, on Friday, then you can get it then. All right, it would help if I shared screen for our lovely Zoom folks. Wait, what were you talking about? Which part? I'm gonna hand out a handout in person, and I thought I had it posted on Blackboard for the Zoom people, but I don't. So let me look real quick. Nope. I really thought I would have thrown it somewhere, but apparently not. Okay. Alrighty, we will go back to our PowerPoint, and just so you know, it's a diagram that walks you through Freud's stages and Erikson's matching theories. So I will post that after class. Okay, there we go. And for folks who are here in person, I'm going to pass those around. That's how I think the money is so there's this front row keeps moving closer and closer to the desk, which makes it hard for me to navigate. Alrighty, so today we are going to be talking about Freud's stages in a lot more detail. And I thought since we kind of rushed through it at the end, I'd back up so that we can talk about those a little more. What's that? Oh, it is posted somewhere. Okay, do you remember where you found it?
Oh, in the reading.
Oh, it's with the readings. Okay. So people on Zoom, it's with the readings. You should be able to find the Excel document there. Thank you for letting me know. So I'm just going to take attendance right quick here. Okay. Welcome. Is anybody here? Okay. All right, so Freud's stages. This is really the heart of Freud's theory and a lot of why other people fought with him, to be perfectly honest. So his idea was that at each stage that you went through, you're going to run into conflicts. And Freud told us this is a natural progression. Everyone should be working through these in their lives. And then if something goes wrong, then that's when you end up with psychopathology, with problems along those lines. And so the way the conflict is resolved or not resolved is going to shape your personality, according to Freud. And if the conflict isn't fully resolved, you can kind of get stuck in that stage, which Freud called fixation, which is a less mature approach to life and to, again, because it's Freud, obtaining sexual gratification. And if all conflicts are resolved, the adult obtains pleasure from healthy, intimate relationships and from work. So this is the important piece, is that Freud talked about that. Alrighty, so again, if you look at the handout I just passed out, folks who just came in, feel free to come up and grab one. You will see Erikson's stages as well. So it's like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th column over. So at each stage, Erikson said there's a crisis, and you have to resolve that crisis. And these are going to shape the child's life, and they're going to be ego strengths that affect the way the child views his or herself or themselves and the world. And so we'll start with the oral stage. And so this is when you're first born. Now, interestingly, when you look at this in different psychology textbooks, sometimes you'll see birth to 2 years, sometimes you'll see birth to 18 months. Different people have sort of interpreted Freud's works differently. So you might see it differently. The one I see most often is the birth to 18 months, so that's what we're rolling with. So the mouth is the source of both pleasure and conflict. You've got things like breastfeeding. That doesn't always go well for everybody, right? Kids can have trouble latching. Mom's gonna have inadequate supplies, things along those lines. But also, the way that kiddos are able to communicate is mostly through crying, right? At that point in time, you can't be like, yo, mom, I need my diaper changed, right? And so you've got to just do it through crying. And babies actually do develop different cries for different things they need. Like I grew to recognize the difference between an I'm hungry cry and a my diaper is wet cry in my daughter. And the source of pleasure, but also the source of tension reduction here are the mouth, the lips, and the tongue. And so if that sounds weird, just think about what happens when you give a kid this age something. What do they do immediately? Put it in their mouth. And that's why you have to be careful what you give kids this age, right? Because they'll put everything in their mouth and they might choke on small things. And so you know, that's, I think, a lot of where Freud got his ideas. It's also where like pacifiers come into play, that this might be a way for the child to comfort themselves. And as they get a little older and teeth start coming in, they might start like chomping on them too, right? So their mouth is their way of understanding and discovering the world at this point in time. The conflict here is weaning. And so weaning, if you're not familiar with this term, is essentially when you switch off the breast or the bottle and move more towards solid foods. And so Freud argued the id wants nourishment, and it's gotten used to getting nourishment in this particular way, right? And so then it's going to resist this. And so the idea is that, are you going to be getting too much pleasure from eating in this way, become dependent on eating this way? Freud argued that this might be some sort of deep-seated fear of not being able to fend for yourself. Another conflict is biting, right? It's pleasurable for the kid, again, especially as they start to get teeth in. It helps, it makes the pain less. But let's say you're breastfeeding, right? And the kid decides biting is a really good idea. That is not a good idea for mom, right? Or if they have siblings, I think that's the whole Charlie bit my finger, right? That viral video. It's pleasurable to the kid, but usually not socially acceptable, right? So you gotta kind of teach them that. And so you see on the handout, Your modes of tension discharge here are sucking, swallowing, biting, but then also looking, grasping, touching, exploring the world. And so Erikson's crisis here is trust versus mistrust. And the idea is, can I trust that my caregiver, whether they're mom, dad, grandparent, aunt, babysitter, whoever, is going to fulfill my needs? Or am I going to learn from this early age not to trust the adults in my life? The idea is you might get stuck, right? Fixated at some of these stages. And that would lead you to have a certain personality or character type. And so for the oral stage, the character type is the oral character type. And this would be people who are dependent, demanding, gullible. Their theme is I get. It's the id, right? The id is really dominating this stage of life. There's some, you'll see this last column sort of arguing that this might be linked to specific pathology later in life. I'm super skeptical, but at least this is what Freud and his followers argued, that it might be later to schizophrenia or some sort of paranoia or even depression if you don't properly resolve this stage. All right, the anal stage. And the anal stage, honestly, is a really good example of how Freud's ideas have gotten into our collective psyche. Right, there's a lot of what Freud talks about that has entered our modern language. Oh, that person's so anal. Can you believe them? Right? And so this is a really good example. Again, you look at different books, you might see slightly different age ranges, but it's basically sort of toddler stage. 18 months to 3.5, somewhere in there. And your pleasure here is derived from the anal sphincter. And the greater focus is on defecating because kids start potty training at this stage. So prior to this stage, prior to asking them to potty train, going to the bathroom has just been an involuntary behavior, right? Kids just go whenever, wherever they want, right? You could be at a restaurant, you know, in the middle of something, and there's just stuff everywhere. I just remember one time I was trying to get out of the house with my daughter, and we had to change outfits like 3 times before we could leave because she kept having like diaper explosions, or she peed while I was changing her diaper, and then there goes that outfit, right? I mean, and they're not purposely doing it. It's just sort of like they go when they're gone. You know, they don't understand it's something that like you should hold in. So part of what you're doing in potty training is training this involuntary behavior to be voluntary, to be something they are supposed to control. And that's really hard. So it's the first attempt at controlling an instinctual impulse. It's the first time really where the id isn't allowed to win, right? Where you're like, no, you have to start not letting the id always take over. They're going to get praise from their parents for completing potty training. And traditionally, punishment would target the buttocks, spanking, right? We're really trying to move away from this in our society because there's a whole host of developmental research that suggests any form of corporal or physical punishment is really detrimental to kids later in life. So again, referring back to our handout here, the modes of tension discharge are retaining, expelling, but also starting to decide. You decide, yeah, I want to use the potty, right? And kids get really proud when they get it, right? They're like, I used the potty. And they might tell everybody, I go poop on the potty now. Don't know that the perfect stranger need to know that, but cool. Compensating. The Erikson crisis here is autonomy versus shame and doubt, right? So you want to start empowering your kiddo to be able to make these decisions on their own, to be less dependent. If you're too harsh, Erikson argued, what can happen is that kid will start to feel shame, not just around going to the potty, but around other things in their lives. So we'll talk more about the anal personality later, but again, it's something that's in our pop culture vernacular. These people are orderly, obstinate, controlling, and essentially the anal retentive personality, which is what we think of when we say the word anal, is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but essentially having to have things a certain way. You're not going to engage in repetitive behaviors like true obsessive compulsive disorder. It's more essentially anal personality. Alrighty, then we get to everyone's favorite stage, the phallic stage. So Freud argued this is between the ages of 3.5 and 6. There we go. So I skip the slide. And the focus here is on the genitals. And that there are pleasurable physical sensations. And modern science, probably not surprisingly, has figured out that this isn't necessarily sexual. It's just kids are exploring their bodies and they find out, if I touch myself in my genital region, it feels good, right? So like, yeah, they're masturbating, but not in the way we think of, right? When we think of it in like a sexual way. I was just telling my intro class about this morning. Great episode of the show House, where he was seeing a clinic patient. It was a little girl and her mom was like, I think she's having seizures. And like House figures out that she's masturbating. And so he's like trying to give the mom all these euphemisms. He's like, she's doing this, she's finding Nemo. And the little girl goes, ah! It's a great little thing. But yeah, kids will do this. Sometimes when I was in college, when I came home for the summer, I would sub in my mom's room. She was a preschool teacher. And at nap time, they would have to tell some of the kids, hands where we can see them, right? And again, it's not that the kids are trying to do anything inappropriate. They're just exploring their bodies, right? So again, you can see where I tried to like, the only way my empirically based mind could sort Freud is to try to explain where he got some of these ideas and that they're not totally out of left field, right? So I try real hard. It doesn't always work, but I try. He also argued that this is the age where kids start to know the differences between girls and boys. Kids will come home and be like, so-and-so has this thing between his legs, right? And why don't I have that? And they may fantasize about sexual acts and masturbate. Again, are they fantasizing? I don't know. Again, from the research I've seen, from the anecdotes I've seen, I think it's more just a physical thing. Alrighty, so then we get to the Oedipus complex. So the tale of Oedipus was a Greek tragedy written by Sophocles. In this story, Oedipus unwittingly, he doesn't know, Oedipus has been like out in the world. I think it was banished as a kid, so he doesn't know his own family. So he ends up killing his own father and marrying his own mother. Again, he doesn't know she's his mom at that point in time. He's unaware of the taboos he has transgressed. But then when he learns that this is what he's done, he blinds himself. So, you know, cautionary tale. Freud took this idea and said that children have an unconscious desire to possess, be married to, perhaps, the opposite sex parent and do away with the same sex parent, get them out of the way, right? And to Freud's credit, even for him, this wasn't literally sexual. It was an unconscious wish to have his mother all to himself, if we think about this from a little boy's point of view, and getting the father out of the way so that they can do that. They see dad as a competitor for mom's attention. And the conflict here is that they would have love for their dad, right? But also feel like they're competing with them. And this is where the term castration anxiety came in. It was the fear that dad would find out and symbolically, or perhaps for some kids physically, castrate them, right? Chop off their penis metaphorically. And this came out of Freud's observations. And again, remember his own life. His mom was 20 years younger than his dad. His mom was, by all reports, a very attractive woman. And Freud said boys are really fond of their moms. And then the idea that girls might be sort of daddy's little girl, right? So boys experience this castration anxiety or fear that affection for mom will be met by emasculation by dad. The idea is, again, some sort of metaphorical castration where dad will take away the phallus or the penis so that the child can never be with his mother. So what Freud argues happens at this point is the little boy decides the best he can do is to become like the guy who has mommy, so to become like dad. And this is known as identification. So identification with the father. And to Freud, this marks the beginning of the resolution of the Oedipal complex. And that leads to the successful resolution of this stage, of the phallic stage. Okay, so we've been talking about boys. What about girls? Well, Freud argued that girls just kind of go through the same thing, basically. That they feel a mixture of affection and love for their father, but they also fear reprisals from their mom. Freud just kept calling this the Oedipus complex. He thought that was universal. He thought that applied. His student, disciple, follower, Jung, came up with the idea of calling it the Electra complex instead. Just sort of recognize that there might be gendered aspects of this. Freud did argue, however, that girls experience penis envy, where they feel inferior to males because they lack the phallus, they lack a penis. So Freud argued that not having the penis, not having this phallus, was girls' castration anxiety, like they've already been metaphorically castrated. And so he said the girl blames the mother for the lack of penis. She desires her father, yet at the same time, she envies him for having the phallus. And Freud was really vague about how girls resolve these conflicts at the phallic stage. He didn't really ever explain it in a lot of detail. But the process of identification is an important component for both boys and girls. So boys identify with their fathers to overcome that wish for their mom, and girls eventually identify with mothers to overcome this penis envy. Both boys and girls are then prepared to later seek out members of the opposite sex for marriage and procreation. As we can see, this is totally heteronormative. There's a lot of really messed up ideas in here. I want to fully acknowledge that, right? And again, this stage, the Oedipus complex, all this good stuff, is why a lot of people who were Freud's followers and really like gung-ho about his ideas eventually came up with their own theories and kind of separated from him. And like, sometimes those separations were nasty. Like, he and Jung just like stopped talking to each other at one point and didn't communicate the rest of their lives. So again, if you refer back to the handout, here we are in the phallic stage. Our zone that we're looking at is the penis or the clitoris. So we've got exploration, manipulation, curiosity, playing. Their key tasks are trying to identify with that adult model to resolve the Oedipal conflicts. Erikson described this as initiative versus guilt. So again, empowering kiddos. The example I tend to use here is, gosh, this kiddo is now in high school, but when I first got here, one of my colleagues had a kiddo who was sort of this age, and his big thing is he likes to wear 2 different socks every day, right? And so his parents could have been like, no, you must wear matching socks. But his mom was just like, cool, I don't have to sort socks anymore. I just throw them in a drawer, right? And so he got, and it wasn't anything that was going to hurt anybody. It wasn't going to hurt him, right? So he got that initiative of, yeah, you want to make this choice? That's cool. If they had been really hard on him about it, then he might have experienced that guilt. The phallic character type was supposed to be daring and seductive and vain. The idea is that they might have like a lack of purpose. And this is where Freud treated the vast majority of his patients with hysterias. So hysterias, back in the day, good old terminology, literally translated means wandering uterus. The ancient idea was that the uterus would actually pick up and move around the body. And whenever you were having a physiological complaint that wasn't explained by anything medical, your uterus had like decided to hang out there. So you're having numbness and paralysis in your arm, your uterus is hanging out in your shoulder, right? Things along those lines. A lot of Freud's patients had things like psychosomatic paralysis, numbness, speaking in different languages, trouble communicating, things along those lines. And he would chalk a lot of that up to difficulties with the phallic stage. All right, and then after that, from age 6 until you hit puberty, Freud said, not much is going on. There's very little psychological development. You're going to learn skills and abilities that are necessary to take on the roles of an adult. You're going to school, right? You're in elementary school at this point. So you're learning about basics of how to learn, how to cooperate with other people. Freud believed there were no conflicts at this phase, that it was a time of rest and latency, and that kids tended to separate from opposite sex at this point. And again, there's a little bit of that you can see, right? This is the stage where you decide the opposite sex has cooties, right? Yeah, cooties, hooray! Things like that. And so Freud argued that what you're doing here is learning to categorize, classify, cooperate, be in some healthy competition with other kids, problem solving, you're expanding your social context. Erickson's crisis here is industry versus inferiority. It's essentially, are you gonna learn to work hard, or are you just gonna like feel bad and like you can never measure up? And the idea was you wouldn't get fixated here. All right, and then you get to the genital period. And this was puberty on for Freud. And so he said that there is a return of overt sexual and aggressive desires at this point in time. And sexual needs begin to get satisfied through socially acceptable means. The libido here is focused on the genitals, and there's no specific conflict. But Freud argued you only get here if you resolve that conflict at the other stages. This is the way that I really like the conceptualization of fixation. So the way I was initially taught fixation is you're just stuck there, right? You don't go on, you don't develop, you don't grow. This is a better description. If you think of your psychic energy, these dynamic forces as an army, and at each stage you have these crises, these conflicts, and their battles. And if the resolution at that stage is incomplete, not all, but some of your soldiers, some of your psychic forces have to stay behind to monitor that particular conflict. It's as if some psychic energy must stand guard lest the psychosexual conflict come through the sensor, break out, spew out in inappropriate ways. And the poorer that stage has been resolved, the more of your psychic soldiers have to be left behind. One consequence of this is that there's less psychic energy available for your subsequent stages, for your subsequent tasks of maturity. The more soldiers brought forward to the genital stage, the more psychic energy can be invested in mature, intimate, and productive relationships, and the better the adult personality adjustment. And note that to Freud, successful personality development was both the ability to be productive in society and to maintain loving relationships. So according to Freud, your personality development is largely completed by the age of 5 or 6 when you hit this latency period. And the adult personality is just dependent on how those previous conflicts that arrived during infancy and early childhood are resolved. So here you are trying to establish intimate relationships and contribute to society. Erikson's stage here is identity versus role diffusion. So the idea is, who am I going to be and how am I going to be that person? The idea here is this person would be working, loving, sexual, and that they would be not selfish, that they would be able to interact with other people in a healthy way. So according to Freud, this developmental trajectory was not negotiable. It wasn't like you could be like, I'm gonna skip over the Oedipal conflict and then like come back to it maybe. He said it's inevitable that we must all negotiate these stages of development despite the obstacles presented in each stage. Individuals who experience problems along the way will have adult personality characteristics that are represented by that stage. And this goes into Freud's ideas about neurosis. Again, neurosis is an old term. It basically means what we would now call the internalizing disorders. Things like depression, anxiety, things where you're turning inward rather than acting out. Things along those lines. So Freud argued that at times, these interpsychic conflicts between our forces, these unconscious conflicts between the id, the ego, and the superego can lead to anxiety. He also argued that there are 3 distinct types of anxiety. The reality anxiety is sometimes called objective anxiety. And this is fear of things that are real dangers in the external world. Example, let's say you're sleeping and the fire alarm goes off, right? You're gonna probably wake up in like a little bit of a panic because you know a fire could kill you, right? Plus it's a really loud, obnoxious sound essentially made to make that in you. So that's reality anxiety. Something's out there that could actually harm you, you're gonna respond to it. From reality anxiety, the other 2 types of anxiety are derived. So moral anxiety is fear of the conscience. So an individual with a well-developed superego will feel guilty, will tend to feel guilty when they do something wrong, or if they even think about doing something wrong, or something that's contrary to the moral code. This has a basis in reality anxiety because when we're growing up, our parents and other caregivers often punish us for violating the moral code. So an example here would be if you even think about cheating on an exam, you would get anxious, right? That's moral anxiety. And this is the fear that like you're gonna somehow break the social contract, do something against the moral norms. Neurotic anxiety, Freud argued, is your fear that your id instincts will get out of control. They'll break through the sensor, they'll come out. And they'll cause you to do something that you'll be punished for. And again, this has a basis in reality anxiety because parents and other caregivers likely punish the child for impulsive actions in the past. Or if they've happened to you as an adult or even a kid in school, right, you've had some sort of social shunning or things along those lines. So the idea is that anxiety is a state of unpleasant tension that is a signal of impending danger. It signals to the ego that it must take appropriate measures to reduce that tension. If the ego doesn't do that, if the ego doesn't try to reduce that tension, the danger may increase to the point where the ego is overthrown by the id. And again, that's going to activate your neurotic anxiety. Typically, your ego is able to handle this with realistic measures. If it can't, then it develops unrealistic measures. And that's where defense mechanisms develop. And this is where you get maladjustment. This is where you get someone not necessarily having a well-developed or good personality. So how does all this fit together? So let's say the child exhibits some sort of sexual or aggressive impulses. The child is then punished for the impulses. Sexual or aggressive impulses in particular may be strongly punished and blocked by extreme external dangers or threats. So intensive parental punishment, such as withdrawal of love. And when we get to talking about some of the post-Freudians, Karen Horney really takes this idea and runs with it. Then this leads to reality anxiety. Reality anxiety is going to emerge. The child may become afraid that their impulses will lead to the loss of parental love. So in time, they begin to fear their own impulses. And thus they try to repress them. And repression in and of itself is the most basic defense mechanism. Just shove it down into the unconscious, get it out of my sight, out of my mind, so I don't act on it. So these unacceptable impulses are repressed. But the problem is, unless they're eventually allowed to be expressed in some acceptable form, they become pent up, they build up. It's sort of like magma building up in a volcano, right? There's building pressure and eventually it's going to have to erupt out somehow. So they become increasingly difficult to repress. So what can happen later is a partial breakdown of that repression, which leads to your neurotic anxiety. So neurotic anxiety, Freud argued, when that starts to emerge, this is signaling to you that those repressed impulses are starting to break through. And if it's expressed, Freud argued it will usually be in some disguised or symbolic form. And again, this is where you get hysteria, where your neurotic anxiety may be physically represented, right? Again, some sort of numbness, tingling, paralysis, speech problems, things along those lines. Now, as a result, you may also develop defense mechanisms, not all of which are healthy, in order to cope. So fixation. This is a great quote from Erich Fromm, who said, "The neurotic lives today as if it were yesterday." So the idea is, if you have this neurotic anxiety, if you have neurosis, as it was described in Freud's time, then you are fixated. You are living as if you were at an earlier stage, at least partially. So this occurs when the conflict is not successfully resolved. And there's a certain amount of frustration and anxiety that's associated with each developmental stage, and you've got to discharge that tension somehow. And if the amount of frustration and anxiety is roughly proportional to the amount of gratification you get at that stage, Freud argued things are fine, and that's when you'll be able to smoothly transition to the next developmental stage, move on through. But if the amount of frustration and anxiety is not roughly proportional to the amount of gratification, that's where you get fixation. That's where you're leaving behind some of those psychic soldiers. So this is called fixation, and it occurs under two conditions. And on both is when the conflict is not successfully resolved. So the first is when you receive too little gratification during a stage of development. And Freud argued this meant you were afraid to move on to the next stage. So for example, Freud tried to explain anorexia nervosa as a response to too little gratification during the oral stage. So thus they were afraid to eat. I don't think a lot of people go with that description in this day and age. But again, that's how Freud tried to explain it. The other problem would be if you experience too much gratification. So if you are always gratified during this stage, you have little or no motivation to go on to the next stage because you're pretty comfy there, right? But if you fixated at a stage, things have gone wrong, basically. Your world is not meeting your needs, and therefore the way that your mind is coping is by kind of keeping you where you are, not allowing you to go forward. So some examples: oral fixation, smoking, right? Consider that, which is hilarious because again, like, not that I want to laugh at the guy's death, but he smoked cigars so much he got jaw cancer, right? So like, I wonder what he would have said about himself, right? Excessive drinking, leeching onto relationships, even things, I would argue, like chewing on pens or pencils or biting your nails might be an indication of oral fixation. And that you might act like a 1-year-old, you might act insecure. The anal stage, being anal retentive. Again, that's that obsessive compulsive personality disorder, type A personality you may have heard of as well. Their orderliness, they want everything just so. And again, ideas where this has come into popular culture, popular vernacular. We say someone has their shit together. That comes from this idea. Or stubbornness, kiss my ass. These phrases are not coincidences, right? Freud was very much a major influence on the way people thought and talked. There's also an anal repulsive fixation, where you just sort of are the opposite. You're messy. Things are everywhere. Your life is not together, right? Things along those lines. If anyone's ever seen the play or the movie The Odd Couple, they are essentially an anal repulsive and an anal retentive personality living together. One's really neat. One is really messy, right? And so that is something that can be problematic, Freud argued. Yeah, and this cartoon down in the corner argued that, like, yeah, so we've got the baby with their oral fixation with their pacifier, but maybe with adults yapping on their phone all the time. That could be oral fixation. Alrighty, so next we're going to start talking about the defense mechanisms themselves. And again, these are ways that we try to cope when we have neurotic anxiety, when our id impulses try to come out. So again, as I mentioned, repression is kind of the initial one, the most basic one. Repression is the process of preventing unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or urges from reaching our conscious awareness. It's the forerunner of all other forms of defense mechanisms. It allows you to avoid anxiety because you never become aware of the conflict. And this idea of avoiding anxiety actually has its place in modern learning theory-based ideas about anxiety. So people think one of the reasons why anxiety is perpetuated is because we avoid situations where we're anxious. And when you do that, that's reinforcing, that's rewarding because you don't have to experience that anxiety, right? And so that's going to make you avoid it even more. And so you never face the anxiety, and that leads you to, unfortunately, for more anxiety. So we're blocking a wish or desire from consciousness. An example would be you don't realize that you're just like seething under the surface and maybe it all pops out one day, right? You start screaming at people. Sure, no one in here has ever had that happen, right? All right, denial. Denial is when you don't want to admit something's wrong with you. Instead, you say, oh, something in the environment made me do this. You don't accept responsibility. You're failing to accept responsibility. And this might show up in daydreams or fantasies about how things might have been if everything was perfect. So you're refusing to believe the reality and own up to your own role in things. For example, being unwilling to admit you have a serious illness. I don't know if anyone saw Thor: Love and Thunder, right? I don't think it's a huge spoiler, but Natalie Portman's character has cancer. And she's like sitting joking with another character, and the character says, "You have stage 4 cancer." And she's like, "Yeah, but out of how many stages?" And she's like, 4. She's like, "They just haven't discovered the other ones yet." Perfect example of denial, right? And this happens to folks who don't want to face their own mortality, understandably. Then you have reaction formation. So this is where you sort of have the opposite reaction. So you're really mad at your boss. So instead of acting out against him because you fear losing your job, you'll be super nice to him. Kill him with kindness, right? So you express an impulse by its opposite. Regression is another big one. So regression is returning to an earlier developmental stage. And this is related to fixation. Freud's idea was like, if you were partially fixated at a stage, it was really easy for you to regress back to that stage. You seek to return to this earlier mode of satisfaction. And it's typically under conditions of frustration or anxiety. So let's say you were partially fixated at the oral stage. What that means is that later in life, when you're under stress, you'll try to get the same type of satisfaction that was appropriate during the oral stage. So if you're partially fixated at the oral stage and you're stressed out, overwhelmed, you may seek oral gratifications, overeating, smoking, drinking, biting your nails. This is where regression comes into play. Regression often occurs under conditions of stress. So these people who are fixated at the oral stage may only engage in these behaviors over drinking, overeating, smoking, during periods of frustration or anxiety. It can also be much more innocent than that. So let's say you have a 9-year-old kiddo, they're afraid to go to the hospital. They might show various infantile behaviors like sitting in their mom's lap or even reverting to thumb sucking. You can also see this in bedwetting coming back up when a kiddo is really stressed out. Alrighty, we'll stop there for today and we'll keep on talking about Freud on Friday.